Welcome to the call with Nancy Sabato, where we have Christ-centered conversations. What if the struggles you're facing right now are actually part of God's plan to shape your faith and lead you towards blessings you can't see? How can trusting Him in the unknown transform your perspective? Vonna, thank you for joining me today.
It's such a privilege to be here. Thanks for having me.
I know you have such an amazing story that you wrote in this book. Glad I didn't know.
Mm.
You shared powerful stories of trusting God. So, can you share a little bit about your life story? Because I know that my listeners love to hear these wonderful stories how God has transformed.
Well, I'd love to. And there are multiple stories in there from my life. So you can kind of guide if I didn't hit on the thing that you wanted, but I'll just give a little bit of background. Um, I like to say that I grew up in rural South Dakota. And there's a ministry leader that said to me, "Isn't that redundant?" And I'm like, well, maybe, but it really was rural. We had, one stoplight in town. I went to a small Christian school, and there were three in my graduating class. So it was pretty small. And my parents were divorced when I was 8. And so I like to tell people, if you're trying to figure out personality by birth order, I'm going to give you a challenge because I'm an only child. And then my parents divorced and both remarried within 2 years, and I became a middle child in two families. So there's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
But what I've noticed throughout all of these stories of life is just how God used those, whether they were times of blessing or times of real challenge. And so, an example of that is not only did my parents divorce, but they had a really volatile marriage. And we grew up in a home where I went to church because of the fact that that was our heritage. It wasn't because of the church or what they were teaching, it was just part of our heritage. And I look back and realize that, if we hadn't gone through the things that we went through, I may not have come to Christ. But it was through that I had the privilege of going to a Christian school, uh, primarily because my parents felt like that was a better education in our situation. And they wanted that for me, which I'm thankful for. When they divorced, I ended up not being able to do that for a number of years, just financially with my parents' situation. And I longed to go back into that setting. And when I did, I was able to be surrounded by people that just exemplified a godly home, godly marriage, godly family, and ultimately came to Christ. I love to fast forward and say my family came to Christ as well, through different means and over many, many years, but just an incredible joy. So that's how I grew up. And then I take that setting and I look at where I am today. And there are so many pieces, as there are in all of our stories, right? To go from point A to point M or N. But I look at what I get to do today and the opportunities that God has given me over these years. And I'm just amazed. This kid from South Dakota has now traveled to 30 countries. I keep track and laugh that I've been in over 111 airports. I've been in all 50 states. And so a lot of challenges along the way, but just God's hand in that has been amazing.
Hmm. Well, what's one story in your book that you would love for the audience to know about, where you saw God really working in your life?
Yeah. Well, there's one story that has almost some mini stories within it. And I talk about in 2016, I was serving as the managing partner of a national CPA firm, had been there 20 years. And I told people all the time, I'll be here another 20 and then retire. Like that was where I was going to be. And I sensed God calling me that year to leave that firm. And he wasn't calling me to something, he was calling me out of something. And I loved what I did. I loved our clients. I loved the staff. I loved my role. We really were invested in that firm as a family. My husband was a stay-at-home dad, so Yeah, I'll encourage people. It was not like, oh, yeah, I decided I'd just leave my job. Like that was our sole income. And as I prayed about it, I just really sensed that strongly. And we had a family trip to Kenya coming up with World Vision. And as my husband and I talked about it, he said, let's go to Kenya. Let's get a little distance. And when we come back, let's talk about it. And so we did that. It was an amazing trip for our family. And when we got back, the sense was even stronger. And we agreed that it was a matter of obedience.
Mm.
And so I went to the partners the 1st of September, and I was supposed to give 12 months notice. And I went to the partners and said to them, I'm going to leave at the end of the year. I'm giving you 4 months notice. And I think if I don't do this, it's going to be detrimental to the firm and detrimental to our family. And it was a firm that was only serving Christian ministries and churches. They were fellow believers. They understood and they were gracious about it. But in that same week, our oldest daughter was a senior in high school, and that was her first game of her senior season of volleyball, and she incurred a really significant injury. So
Wow.
I'll let her tell her own story. She's got her own chapter in the book, but I'll just leave it at that was pretty impactful for us. 2 weeks later, she and my husband were out of town, and our youngest daughter and I just went away for the weekend. And when we came back on Sunday morning to get ready for church and go to our church, we opened up the front door of our house to find that shortly after we had left on Friday night, a gasket in the toilet broke and sprayed water into our house for about 36 hours and did $60,000 worth of damage. We were out of our main living area for 4 months. And a month later, my stepdad passed away. So all four of those things happened over the course of 2 months' time. And I like to say that the pain and the strain and the uncertainty were constant and sometimes extreme. But in the midst of all of that, God was in it. And as I look back, I can say about those things, boy, I'm glad I didn't know. I'd have avoided so many of those. But at the same time, then I look at the lessons that were learned as a result of that and what I'd have missed out on if I'd have messed it up and tried to take control of it. And I'm so thankful.
So many people go through that. They go through those hills and valleys, and when they're in the valley, they don't realize that that's where like the big spiritual learning is coming in. That's the stuff you remember, right? Maybe you didn't like it happening, but that's when you really start to see God working in your life, growing you and making you stronger. And you have just gone through so much more. And I think everybody's going to have to read the book, Glad I Didn't Know, because I'm glad I didn't know about half the stuff that I went through either. So I think somebody's going to really enjoy reading it. And so, someone can get stuck in their struggles
Mhm.
and start seeing their challenges. How can they see it as God's bigger plan?
Well, and that's what I love about the book, Nancy, is that initially I wrote all the chapters of that book. And then I and a mentor of mine were visiting about it one day, and I realized if that's what I published, people would look at it and say, oh, that was her story. That's how God worked in her life. And what I want people to understand is no, that's how God works. And
Hmm.
so I invited 16 other people in, and only half the chapters are mine. The other half are all different stories from different people. And what I've heard people say to me as they've read the book is, what stood out to me right now was this chapter. And they'll tell me about that chapter and how it impacts their life. And then they'll step back and say, but if I read this again in 6 months or a year, I can really see how another chapter would be different and would impact me differently because we go through different struggles. And I would also say, I would just encourage people, there are things we should be glad we didn't know that are blessings as well.
Hmm.
Because the struggles in life, we often would do what we could to avoid them. and we'd miss out on the lessons you were just talking about. I really haven't had anyone that came to me that said, the time that I grew most in my faith was when I was on the mountaintop and things were great and everything was perfect. I just haven't. The people that come to me that say, I learned the most when I was in that valley and I was struggling. But with blessings, what I have found is that if I knew in advance, I would try to orchestrate it. I had the privilege of serving as the chair of the World Vision US board, which again, with coming from South Dakota, like that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And if you had told me that 10 or 15 years ago that you're going to do this, I'd have thought, oh, well, I need this experience and this education, and I need to network with these people. And
Yeah.
what God said was, I just need you to be obedient. And the next step, and the next step, and the next step. And so I encourage people often to think about, what would your life look like if you only had what you'd prayed for?
That's so true.
Because you wouldn't have prayed for that difficulty. You wouldn't have prayed for that struggle, but you'd have missed out on what God was doing. And in those blessings, you probably wouldn't have had near the number of blessings because God does immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine, right? So
Yeah.
we'd have asked for A and he gave us double A or triple A. And so that's my encouragement to people that are struggling, is that you're not alone. Everyone has those challenges. The story I like to tell about that briefly is, I remember when my brother-in-law was passing away of cancer, and we were caring for him, and that story is in there as well. But I remember sitting at a stoplight one day when I was running an errand and looking around at the other cars in that stoplight and thinking, everybody else here is having a normal day. Like they're on their lunch break from work and they're going to stop and they're going to pick up groceries. They're having a normal day. And my life is anything but normal right now. And so my encouragement is, we all have those, right? And I try to challenge people, when you're sitting at the stoplight now, pray for the people around you, because somebody there isn't having a normal day, right? They're in the midst of their struggle, but that's how God works. And that's when we see him most clearly.
Yeah, God just breaks us down, doesn't he? He breaks us down to the core so that we can really know him in a bigger way, right? Know the struggles that he said we're going to have trials, right? And so it's sad, but we got to say, we got to embrace these trials, right?
We do. And, as I've been speaking and talking about the stories in here and just having opportunities to hear people's stories, and that is one thing that's really become so evident. And Nancy, you do this well, because that's why you have this broadcast that you have. There's such power in story.
Oh,
And that's how Jesus taught. I've been reminded of that so much in the last few months, that Jesus just taught by story, and these stories do that same thing. And as I've been telling the stories and thinking about the impact and the struggles, I've really been impressed upon by 1 Thessalonians 5:16 through 18. It's so simple. Rejoice always. Pray continually. Give thanks in all circumstances. Okay, those are three simple things. That last verse ends with, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. And how many of us, I would say most believers, at various points in our life say, I want God's will for me. And we try and seek it and find it. And he's like, hey, silly, it's right here. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks without ceasing. This is my will for you in Christ Jesus. He's told us. And so I've been challenged. I had one of those days on Tuesday where you have in your career where you have this really high, like we really accomplished this thing. And 20 minutes later, I was on a call with someone else and they gave me bad news. And I was like, well, easy come, easy go. And I was sitting on that call with that person who was delivering the bad news. And what came to mind was, okay, rejoice always. All right, Lord, I don't see it, but you've told me I have to do it. And so I'm praying about this and I'm going to give thanks, but where are you going with this? And so it's really kind of changed my attitude. I still am that driven, competitive, type A personality. And God's trying to get a hold of my heart and just say those three simple things.
yeah, I love that. Wow. I know I myself sometimes find myself there, but I do know people that are like this as well. And they do really have a hard time sometimes, not controlling it. But the thing is I think one thing that I do, and it's really hard, is to surrender. And
Mm.
when you surrender, then you know that he can guide your path. He's got an open window to you, right? When you surrender. So why do people worry so much about the future?
Well, I think to a significant extent, it's because we are controlling. I've asked audiences lately, how many of you, if you're going somewhere in a car, would prefer to drive? And most of the hands go up, right? Because we're a controlling society. And what I tell people is, I used to go to the Lord and say, hey, I won't bother you. Just, I've got my plan right here. If you could just sign here, I'll be on my way. I won't bother you at all. I'm trying to get better and say, okay, Lord, what is your plan? And what I've joked about is maybe in another 2 or 3 decades, I'll be like, and in your time, because right now I'm like, and could you just do that now? Like, could we move this process along? But I do think that it's a matter of control. And so honestly, when tragedies happen, and we've seen a number of them recently, we tend to look for an excuse, a reason. We tend to look for someone to blame.
Mm,
And my perspective on that is because then we don't feel like we're subject to that. If we
mm,
just fix that, or if we avoid that because we're in control, then we won't be subject to that. We
mm,
want to control as many of the elements as we can and eliminate the risk that exists. And when we can't do that because it's not how it's designed,
mhm,
that's when fear and worry come in.
mm. Well, was there a time you wish you knew what was coming, but later saw God working in unexpected ways? I know we went down this a little bit, but there's got to be something budding up in your mind.
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, that's what the whole book is, right? It's
Yes.
all stories of that. And I love, as you've held it up a couple times, I love that you've got little sticky notes in there. That just makes my heart happy to see those tabs hanging off of that. So I'll say two things to that. One, what I have told people is um, there are certain things that I wish I had known. For example, I told you that our house flooded. Had I known that was going to happen, I would have shut off the water valve like my husband did every time we left the house for more than 24 hours. I literally walked past it that day and thought he would shut that off. Oh, we'll be back in 2 days, and didn't take the 15 seconds it would have taken. So I joke about that and say, okay, there are some things that I would have done. Though, side note on that, it ended up being that God was moving us, and insurance paid for a complete remodel, and so our house went on the market with this remodeled kitchen and bathroom and everything that we would never have done. So those are the fun things to see how God used that. Um, but to your point, the story that led to this book was that after that time frame that we've just talked about, putting the house on the market, the Lord made it really clear that we were supposed to move from California to Virginia. And I argued with him. And I don't know if you've ever done that. If you haven't, don't waste your time. If you have, you know how futile it is. But I had very well-reasoned arguments for him. I didn't want to quit my job because it was economically dumb, and it was not a good time. Our youngest daughter was going into high school, and I had those arguments, and we made it through that. And then he made it clear that we were going to move. And again, I argued with him. I loved our house. I loved our church. I loved the girls' school. I loved our neighbors. I lived in Southern California. I loved the weather. Um, and he made it clear that he was moving us, and he moved us to Virginia. And we had a really difficult time settling in there. It was a great move for our youngest daughter. And that was one of the byproducts of Glad I Didn't Know, because she thrived there. But we moved for a job that I took, and that again was very evident that that was the next step for me and what God wanted me to do. And I was there 18 months, and that job suddenly ended. And I found myself living in a state that I hadn't wanted to move to, not plugged in a church because we hadn't found a good church home at that point, without a job, again, being the sole source of income in our home, having no income. And so I was pouting. And I said to the Lord, we did exactly what you told us to do. And now look where we are. And it was in that time that God really brought this concept of glad I didn't know to mind. And he brought back all of those really difficult times that we had gone through in life and the lessons that we'd learned as a result of them, and how I was glad I didn't know because I would have avoided it. And it was like he said, and if you'd have known this, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have been obedient. You wouldn't have gone to Virginia. You wouldn't have taken this job. And now look at what I'm going to do. And he did a number of things. Like I said, our youngest daughter thrived here. This really launched her into adulthood in a meaningful way. I started a consulting practice, which people had told me to do for years. And I said, no, I'm left-brained. I need that income the 15th and the 30th of every month. I don't want to do consulting. And I've done it for the last, 6 years now. I love it. Just so many doors the Lord opened. And I don't know that we'd have this book if it wasn't for those times.
Well, I do have to ask you, this is my big question. How do we plan for the future while still surrendering control to God?
Well, James 5:13 through 16 has kind of been I don't know that it's my life passage, but it has impacted me significantly because it talks about, you who say you're going to go to this city and do this or that, buy and sell and get gain. You don't even know what's going to happen today. Your life is a vapor. And what you ought to say is, if the Lord wills, this is what I'll do. And so for someone who lives life very organized, very planned, that's such a good reminder to me. And so whether you're a planner or not a planner, whether you're a control freak or you're able to just relax in who God is and what he does, I think that's an encouragement for us. God's got this. We just need to say, if the Lord wills, we'll do this or that, and rest in that. And so we need to be obedient, and he will be faithful.
I love that answer because I know somebody out there who might have this little control thing going on, just needs to know that, you still can just kind of surrender it all to Jesus and surrender it to God. So, what's one practical step viewers can take this week to trust God in their challenges that even they can read through the book?
I'd love to answer that question. Yeah, please read the book. I'd love for you to do that. But the challenge that I have is to take a little bit of time, set it aside, look through your life, and come up with your own glad I didn't know stories. Both the challenges and those amazing blessings that God has given, and reflect on what God has done. Because as you look back and see those things, it can't help but encourage you as you go forward.
Wonderful. Now, you can find out more about Vonna and get this book, okay, on gladididn'tknow.com. And Vonna, what would you like to leave my audience with today?
Share your story and know that as you go through any difficulties that you're going through, and as you're in the high seasons change, they come and go. So enjoy the high seasons and know that when you're in that fall and winter of life and you're going through the challenges, that spring's around the corner because God's faithful.
Well, thanks for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this interview, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. And don't forget to like and subscribe and share. For more Christ-centered conversations, visit the website, thecallwithNancySabato.com. And until next time, All glory and honor to King Jesus.